When I was a kid, my dad used to wake up before dawn, like before the house was awake, before the lights were on, before the day had started making demands. He would leave the house in the dark, in the cold Yukon morning air, and go to Tim Hortons. It was kind of his church. He would sit there alone with coffee, prayer, spiritual books, and cigarettes, back when you could smoke in restaurants, reading, thinking, being in silence. By the time my mom, my brother, and I would pile into the car to meet him downtown, he'd already been awake for hours, and he had this calmness about him. I remember the smell of his drum tobacco on his clothes. Even now, I can't smell tobacco without thinking of those winter mornings. The cold air, the dark sky, the feeling that the world was still asleep. We'd say, "Hi, Dad," stuff a sausage roll with ketchup into our mouths, and then we'd drop him off at Tire Town. He'd spend the rest of the day hauling tires and fixing things. But what I remember most is that he seemed happiest in those early hours. Those hours where it was just him, a coffee, a book, a cigarette, and whatever private conversation he was having with God or truth or himself. As a kid, I didn't have language for it, but I could feel the contrast. My dad had this huge inner life, philosophical, spiritual, curious, hungry for something real. And then his outer life looked ordinary, small even. He didn't finish college. He worked blue-collar jobs, surveyor, diamond driller, dishwasher, tire patcher, butcher's assistant, factory worker. And I always wondered if he felt disappointed by that. But mostly what I remember is that he seemed sustained by something the world couldn't really see. I don't think I understood that he was doing something intentional. To me, he was just my dad, deep in thought, intense, often moody, but also goofy in a way that could surprise you. He'd let my brother and me ride on his back while we yelled, "Horsey, go faster!" He was a man who would go from handwriting letters to a Jesuit priest at 4 a.m. to hauling tires a few hours later. That pen-pal relationship lasted for years. Sometimes he'd come home from work so moody we'd know to stay away. He had this whole weather system inside of him. I'd feel his frustration, and because I was a kid, I think he was angry at me. He wasn't mad at me, it turns out. One time, my mom needed us to go somewhere after school, so she dropped us off at Tire Town. My brother and I played hide and seek, climbing through huge stacks of tires. My skin smelled like rubber. It was a black playground. When I went to find my dad, he was in a shared office, wallpapered, ceiling to floor with images of naked women. I was stunned. A jolly bearded man jumped up from his seat. "Hi, kids!" And then I saw my dad, who introduced us to his colleague. I was curious about the images, and I asked my dad after we left the room. He just shook his head. When we stopped going to church as a family, he insisted on Sunday tea, and we'd sit around and talk about God, philosophy, truth, and the universe. My brother and I would get so silly. We were children, and God felt similar to the Easter Bunny. I didn't know what to call what he was trying to instill in me. Now, years later as a writer, I think I understand him more. Because a creative life is like that too. There's this inner room that you have to keep returning to, a private place where no one is validating you yet. No one is saying, "Wow, this is important." And still, we go there, or at least we try to. Because that's the part that keeps us alive when our outer lives feel ordinary or small. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because so many of us are making things right now. Writing, teaching, coaching, performing, building little worlds online, trying to make a life that feels like ours. And underneath all of it, there's this quiet question: what if no one sees it? It reminds me of what my dad used to say: if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, did it fall? Does it mean I failed if no one hears me? That's the tension. Because we live in a culture that tells us proof is outside of us. Proof is virality, followers, wealth, being chosen. And I don't think we're shallow for wanting that. I want my work to reach people. I want it to matter. But there's this point where the need to be seen starts to distort the work. It makes us impatient. It makes us perform certainty before we actually have it, and turn every human thing into a social media post, which is bleak and also very tempting. I know this because I started writing on Substack 2.5 years ago, right when my life had become what I would call transitional, which is a nice word for what the hell is happening. I was about to turn 40. I'd been auditioning into the void for years, and then the writer's strike happened. I'd quit my stable corporate job because apparently I needed the crisis to have layers. And then my husband and I had to move out of the home we'd lived in for years because our landlord sold it. No job title I trusted, no acting career I could point to, and then suddenly no home either. The rental market was bleak. Everything was either wildly expensive or looked like a place where a true crime documentary was filmed. So we put everything into storage and dipped into our savings and traveled through Central America for 5 months. And I started writing in the early mornings before the heat took over my energy. Over those 5 months, I slept in 48 different beds and I wrote in all of them. I wrote through my 40th birthday in Panama, through protests that made us leave in the middle of the night and eventually flee to Costa Rica, through a loneliness in El Salvador that almost felt physical. And I was like writing to 5 people, maybe 12, but spiritually 5. Some days I wrote because I had something to say. And other days, the less noble truths, I wrote because I wanted proof that I wasn't wasting my life. I wanted the internet to look back at me and say, yes, this is something. And sometimes it did. A comment would come in, or someone would send a message saying, thank you for writing this. I almost quit and it made me keep going. And then my whole body would light up and just be like, oh yes, there it is. And then other times I'd publish something, put my whole heart into it, and it would just sit there. No small sign from the universe that said, keep going. This is not humiliating. And I hated how quickly silence became a verdict. Not people are busy, not the internet is weird and unpredictable, just immediately, maybe I'm no good, maybe I'm boring, maybe I should stop writing to no one. Which is a very dramatic conclusion to draw from an email platform. But that's what happens when the work is still tender. You don't just want readers, you want witnesses. And I think the part of why this feels so intense right now is because that dream feels broken. Work hard, be good, keep going, and eventually the world will reward you with stability, meaning, and maybe even a kitchen island and a calm nervous system. But for a lot of people, the math doesn't add up anymore. So we look for proof wherever we can get it. This is where I think about something my dad wrote years ago to me. I was at university, and one day I got an email I could tell had come from a hard shift. He didn't say, I'm having a hard day. That wasn't really his style. Instead, he sent me a kind of manifesto from the dish pit. He called himself the Master Dishwasher, MDW. He wrote, I am a superior dishwasher, filled with energy by the act of the will. He wrote about moving efficiently around the dish pit, washing pots and pans minute by minute, hour by hour. He wrote about seeing the inequality of power relationships without letting that observation steal his joy. Most people have a bad day at work and send a bitter text. My dad had a bad day and became a monk at the sink. And then he wrote this: to absorb the contempt of those with imagined superiority and return them my contented smile. I mean, who writes like Shakespeare while scrubbing egg off a plate? And then this line, which I've never stopped thinking about. Through it, I overcome my spiritual inertia. The way of the dishwasher is the straight path. To be a master dishwasher is to rest in the shade of the Most High. I hear a person trying to keep his soul intact inside work that could have made him feel worthless. And I think that's the part I understand differently now. My dad had a reason to return to the work even when the work looked small from the outside. His spiritual life was not a hobby. It was the thing that kept him intact. That's what I started to learn on Substack too. The first time I experienced any kind of real momentum, it happened after a long stretch of feeling like I was mostly writing into the void. I shared a note about my 2-year odyssey on Substack, 24 months, 48 essays, 136 subscribers, notes rarely seen, posts lightly engaged, and yet word by word, sentence by sentence, I had built something real for myself. My voice was gaining strength quietly but surely. The note was about my why, my belief that we're here to reach our full expressive abilities before we leave. To bloom, yes, in our very own unique, weird little way. I wrote about the private devotion of making things nobody sees. And then people started responding. Not just liking it, but writers shared with me their own "is it worth it" moments. People said they felt like ghosts in their own work, like they had been yelling into a canyon and not even getting the dignity of an echo. The next morning, there were hundreds more. I kept refreshing my page like one of those mice tapping on a trigger for more cocaine. Between teaching Pilates classes, I was watching the numbers climb. My thumb was cramping from repetitive strain injury, which felt both pathetic and medically legit. By the next morning, there were hundreds more. I lay in bed, phone in hand, barely moving, typing thank you after thank you after thank you. When I finally got up to hydrate, my mattress had a perfect body imprint, like a chalk outline at a crime scene. My fingers were sore. My t-shirt had small sweat halos, and I couldn't believe the kindness pouring in. Isn't it ironic? I had spent so much time wanting my work to prove something about me, but the work started to have an impact when it became more about connecting with people on a real level, on the level of my why. It wasn't me standing there on my little internet stage saying, "Look at me." It was people reflecting back their own secret doubts and reasons for not quitting. It wasn't just growth, it was community. And this is where I come back to those Tim Hortons mornings. My dad sitting under the fluorescent lights before work, reading in the dark hours, feeding something in himself before the rest of the day could touch him. Master Dishwasher, MDW, a title no one gave him, one he gave himself. There is something rebellious and sacred about the parts of us still forming in the dark, and I think creative people need that more than we admit. We need a relationship to the work that can survive silence, because in those unseen hours, you have to decide, does the work only count when it's witnessed? Or does it matter because it's shaping you first? When you know why you're doing the work, the silence doesn't disappear, it just stops messing with you. So that's the question I want to leave with you. What are you really tending to when nobody's watching? That's what I explore in my Substack Wannabe Wisdom, the deeper reason behind our work. This is step 1 of 3 to reaching your full expression. This is for entrepreneurs, creatives, and educators. If you want to go deeper, consider becoming a paid subscriber to access frameworks, hypnotherapy audios, and my guide to getting started on Substack. Check out the link in the description below. And wherever you are in the unseen hours, I hope you keep going.